On June 16, 1812, the British government backed down. Anxious to avoid war with the United States, it suspended a policy known as the Orders in Council. This policy prohibited U.S. merchants from trading with Britain's enemy, France. And it led the British to seize countless U.S. ships and to force thousands of American crew members into the British Navy. But in those days of slow transatlantic communication, word of the repeal arrived in the U.S. too late. Just 2 days after the British repealed the much-hated Orders in Council, the U.S. Congress declared war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 was on. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 47, in which we look at a crucial war in American history that's often overlooked, the War of 1812. We are coming to you this week from the Dolly Madison studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and also our new YouTube channel. Working her magic from behind the glass is our executive producer, Lulu Spencer. Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode of In the Past Lane. Things are kind of hectic around here, what with final exams and papers to grade, plus the usual super busy holiday season with parties and concerts and all that. But we're all in the holiday season spirit. Most of us, anyway. Hey, Lulu, I was thinking we should spiff up the studio with some Christmas decorations.
How about we don't?
Okay, I suppose that's also an option. Anyway, we've got a terrific episode for you this week. I speak with historian Willard Sterne Randall about Unshackling America, his new book about the War of 1812. But before we jump into that interview, it's probably a good idea to do a little background on the War of 1812. It's such an important war, but it's totally overshadowed by larger conflicts like the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War I and World War II. So here's some essential background. The War of 1812 lasted 3 years, 1812 to 1815. And it's the culmination of almost 2 decades of rising tension between the fledgling United States and the world's greatest superpower, and former colonial ruler, Great Britain. There were 2 primary sources for this tension. First, after America gained its independence, Great Britain still wanted to dominate the U.S. economically, and to control it, basically like a semi-independent satellite state. A second source of this tension was the almost unceasing war that raged between Great Britain and France from the early 1790s to 1815. The last years of this conflict, from 1803 to 1815, are known as the Napoleonic Wars. During this period, the U.S. faced intense pressure from the French to join their fight against the British. And, conversely, the U.S. faced great pressure from the British, who insisted the U.S. aid them in their fight against the French. Under Jefferson, the U.S. struggled to maintain a position of neutrality. And when the seizure of U.S. ships and sailors by the French and British threatened to pull the U.S. into war, Jefferson imposed an economic embargo, essentially closing all U.S. harbors and maritime commerce. The embargo proved to be a disaster for the U.S. economy, and it failed to strengthen U.S. neutrality. The British kept seizing U.S. ships and forcing thousands of American sailors into the British Navy, a policy known as impressment. Finally, in 1812, under a more hawkish President James Madison, the U.S. declared war on Great Britain. All right, I think that's enough background. Actually, one more thing. If you want to know more about the 1790s and the political, economic, and diplomatic turmoil that buffeted the young United States, check out my interview with Carol Birkin about her recent book on that period. That's episode number 28 of In the Past Lane. Okay, people, it's getting cold out there, so let's turn up the heat. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. We are back at In the Past Lane, and with me now is Willard Sterne Randall. He is a historian and distinguished scholar and professor emeritus at Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont. Randall is the author of many biographies of figures related to the American Revolution and the early Republic. These include Alexander Hamilton, A Life, and Ethan Allen, His Life and Times. Today, we are very eager to speak with him about his latest work, Unshackling America, How the War of 1812 Truly Ended the American Revolution, just published by St. Martin's Press. Willard Sterne Randall, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thanks very much, Ed.
Well, I'd like to begin by having you tell our listeners why the War of 1812, which in many ways is a largely forgotten war in the American memory, why it's actually an incredibly important moment in American history. And you get at that significance in the title of your book, Unshackling America, and then the subtitle, How the War of 1812 Truly Ended the American Revolution. So how is the War of 1812 tied to the American Revolution, and what makes this an important chapter in U.S. history?
I think really the revolution was not over until the end of the War of 1812 because the Revolutionary War, which was the first phase of a 50-year-long struggle with England for complete autonomy and independence, did not clear up many of the principal problems that started the revolutionary cycle. British control of American trade was essential. And when we were colonies, the British had every legal right to do that. But when the Revolutionary War was over and both sides signed the Treaty of Paris, it appeared to everyone, including our founding fathers, that this meant we would be able to handle our own business affairs, our own international affairs, our own borders, and that wasn't the case. Immediately, both sides broke the Treaty of Paris. The Americans tried to stiff the English by trying to pay them in horribly depreciated continental currency and leading to the saying that it's not worth a continental. And the British said, no, you ran up your debts in silver and gold. You have to pay up. And if you won't pay up, we're not going to withdraw our troops. And most people don't know that the British maintained forts and trading posts all around the Great Lakes, across the Canadian frontier, across the border from Vermont, from Maine, until 15 years after the Revolutionary War was over. By then, the British had started seizing American ships, stopping them, taking off people they said were deserters, when they actually, many of them were naturalized American citizens, because the British would not recognize this new doctrine of naturalization. Born English, you died English. So we were in a struggle that never stopped. It just submerged. From the outside, it didn't appear anything was wrong. But the British really were trying to stifle us and make sure we were not an economic rival. So what I have found with my research is that actually this was a trade war. Winston Churchill put it that way in his History of the English-Speaking People. This was an unofficial trade war, and it went on from the beginning of the American Revolution, officially, all the way through the beginning of the War of 1812, when the Americans just wouldn't take it anymore.
Right. And would you say that the goal of the British is not to reacquire the former American colonies, but to really hold them as a satellite, as a submissive power that they can control and the trade that they can control? Is that their primary goal?
Well, their primary goal really was to exclude us from the British Empire. We were treated very much like a banana republic. They still wanted the raw materials that we had provided before the Revolutionary War, but they wanted to charge us for using their ships, their crews, their docks, telling us what we could have, what the prices were, and then continuing to export to us things that they didn't want at prices that we didn't want. So they never got it through their bodkin that we were no longer colonists, and they tried to treat us as if we still were.
And that situation really begins to worsen because this struggle between the U.S. and its former mother country is increasingly embedded in this larger global war, or certainly an Atlantic war that Europeans refer to as the Napoleonic Wars. And so tell our listeners a little bit more about how that economic struggle between the U.S. and the British gets amped up during this really critical time in Atlantic history, and from the British perspective, a really critical time for them.
Well, from the point of view of the British, they were struggling to save the world from Napoleon's armies and navies. At the same time, as they considered us colonists, we were supposed to be clearly on their side, give them what they needed, what they wanted, but have no contact, no commerce whatsoever with their enemy, France. France, conversely, said, no, we have a treaty with you, a treaty of alliance of 1778, alliance and commerce. So you cannot have anything to do with the British. We were really in the middle. And actually, it affected our national politics because there were no political parties in the Constitution. They formed on whether you favored the British in the Napoleonic Wars or you favored the French. So Washington, with the strong support of Hamilton, was very much, believe it or not, pro-British because his commerce, his trade, all his business dealings had been in terms of England. Whereas Jefferson and Madison and the people heading west away from the Atlantic coast into the interior were turning their backs on all of that, and they could trade down the Mississippi through New Orleans to the French islands and the Caribbean, etc. So the country was dividing politically, even as it was dividing geographically at this time. A lot of people did not want war.
Yes, but eventually that changes, and the British policy of impressment, taking American sailors off American ships and forcing them to serve on British ships, and seizing American cargoes and entire ships in many cases, these policies stoke American anger and pro-war sentiment. Tell us more about that.
Well, the British kept pushing it. They needed sailors. They had 900 men of war fighting Napoleon. They were trying to blockade Europe. They fought him all the way over on the Nile. They fought him in the Mediterranean. They fought him in the Indian. And the casualty rate in that war is horrific. It's something like 85%. So they decided, well, since the sailors on American ships are really English, we can just stop those ships and take whatever we want. And we can say, well, they're really deserters. Well, some of them were. 40% of our merchant marine sailors were born in Britain or Ireland, but they were naturalized, or they had bought phony papers, but they were no longer English subjects. The British weren't bothered by that. And as that got worse and worse, they kept coming in and blockading our ports. You couldn't take a shipload of produce from Pennsylvania into New York Harbor without having a cannon fired across your bow, and you have to sit there all day with a line of ships until the British come onto your ship, search it for deserters, see if you have any French goods or anything headed for France. If they thought you did or could assert they would just take your ship, sail it away to Halifax, sell it, and pocket the money. I mean, it got more and more outrageous over about a period of 15 years.
And the statistics that you cite are pretty alarming. People have raised the question now and again, was impressment really a serious problem? But you cite almost 10,000 sailors.
Right. I think the number is 9,917 that have been documented by the British.
Yeah, it's a pretty staggering number. And then in terms of ships, 1,500 ships or so seized?
1,500 ships they seized between 1793 and 1812. That's before the actual war resumes or begins, however you want to say it. We would take an equal number back from them with our privateers and our tiny American Navy during the war itself, but they seized 1,500. And the captains of these ships, there was like a schedule of loot called prize money. So if they could anyway take your ship and justify it through an admiralty court that was an absolute farce, then the captain and the lieutenants, all the way down to the crew, had their share of what the ship sold for. It could then be refitted, usually as a British privateer, and they pocketed the money. The amount of money involved was phenomenal. So you had the British government, in effect, sanctioning a kind of piracy against the Americans under the guise of this Napoleonic War.
So this is really, it's an economic war with long roots back to the colonial period. But in this case, right there in the early 1800s and up to the war itself, it's really a question of sovereignty. I mean, this is a struggling American nation that is essentially being beaten around as though it isn't really an independent nation that should enjoy full rights and privileges thereof on the international scene. Isn't that at the center of...
That's exactly right, because they just sort of chipped away at what should have been sovereignty, not only denying a naturalization, but saying that we couldn't remain neutral. So we were trying to follow a new doctrine of relatively new, 100 years old or so, of neutral rights. We were not, according to the British, entitled to that. You were either with them or you were against them. But they also cut off all trade from the British Empire, unless it was on their ships. The saying was English goods in English bottoms. They reimposed a colonial-era law, the Navigation Act 1756, that said you had to use their ships. You could not bring your ships into their harbor unless you paid outrageous customs duties, etc., etc. But they also cut us off from our traditional trading routes with Canada, for New England especially, overland or by ship, and with the Caribbean. And then they asked their treaty allies, Spain and Portugal, to do the same thing. So they were cutting us off from trading even with the Spanish and the Portuguese when you're all through, cutting off everything all around the original 13 states.
So this is the situation in Jefferson's administration and then with Madison. So how do we get from that situation where we're being buffeted about by this great global power? But as you noted earlier, not everybody is pro-war. In fact, some people are quite leery of it just from a standpoint that this is a David and Goliath matchup if there ever was one. But there are others that are opposed to it because of other sort of regional concerns and their own specific economic concerns, the different attitudes in New England versus the American South. How does the nation ultimately go to war in June of 1812?
Well, the impressment crisis was just getting worse and worse. There were a couple of episodes, some that we don't know about. One I opened the book with, and that is two brothers sailing a sloop up from Delaware full of vegetables into New York Harbor, and cannonball fired at another ship beheads one of the brothers. And so the survivor somehow gets the sloop into the port, carrying his decapitated brother through the streets, putting him in front of the Tontine Coffee House, which was the original stock exchange. And New York went riot. Just absolutely. The British consul had to barricade himself in his house. It became an international crisis at that point. Jefferson, as president, was a pacifist, although full of conflicts as usual. The founder of West Point also dismantled our first Navy, built by Washington and Adams. He did not want war. He tried diplomacy. The British wouldn't back off. They were the superpower. Why should they give up anything? So diplomacy failed. Jefferson then tried one of the most disastrous experiments in statecraft on our record, and that's called the embargo. In 1 year, 80% of our economy went down the drain. There were soup lines in Portsmouth, and the whaling industry died because no American ships were allowed in or out anywhere. So that didn't work. And at the same time, there's mass immigration coming. There's a refugee crisis. Because of the French Revolution, you have French fleeing the Reign of Terror, about 25,000 of them pouring into the coastal towns of Philadelphia and Baltimore especially. And then you have a slave insurrection in the Caribbean. So you have thousands of those planters and their families fleeing also to the United States. And Americans didn't want all those Frenchmen there. Adams actually asked why one particular fellow had to go, said, well, because he's too French. So New England had a bad experience with the French in Canada. The Southerners loved the French. They loved their perfume and their gowns and their fashions and their wine and all of that. They didn't want to fight the French, and they didn't particularly want to fight the English. They wanted to head west and take more land, and that's when they ran into the Indians. They ran into this brilliant strategist called Tecumseh, who was going back and forth telling his people, we have to unite, stop fighting each other. We have to be the barrier to keep these white people from coming west and taking more of our lands. And when we kept doing it, then he went over to the British.
Could you tell us about this guy Tecumseh? He's a Shawnee, I don't know if we say tribal chief or certainly a significant figure. And he emerges as one of the key figures in this war. And he brings out an important dimension that you noted, which is that this is a war involving many Native American groups as well. So who is Tecumseh, and how does he sees that this is a crisis for Native Americans and has to make some tough decisions?
Well, Tecumseh was from a Shawnee family on one side and Creek on the other. His mother was a Creek. Her family was from Alabama. And these people were migrating up and down the middle of the country, along the Mississippi, etc. They were being pressed all the time by American settlers, backed by the American army. So from the time he's born, Tecumseh is seeing massive losses of land. He sees his father killed. He goes off when he's 9 years old on the warpath for the first time. By the time he's early 20s, he's the war leader of his group of Shawnee Indians in what we call Ohio. And he's absolutely fearless. He's this really striking figure. And he's fluent in English, although he won't tell the English he knows what they're talking about. He's this brilliant man who says, okay, we have to literally bury the hatchet, not in our backs, but in the backs of our enemies. We have to come together. And by the time the War of 1812 started, he could pull 10,000 men out of these different tribes who had formed a confederation under his leadership. Well, then we did it. While he was off recruiting one day, an American army with Kentucky volunteer militia had a knockdown, drag-out fight in a place called Tippecanoe, Indiana, Tecumseh's base, and destroyed it. So by the time that was over, Tecumseh he either was going to make peace finally with the Americans on his terms, or he was going over to the British, who were offering him the fur trade and guns. And the fur trade is under the surface of all of this. And he actually asked for an interview with President Madison, and it was all set up except a White House aide said, he can come, but he has to come alone. He can't bring anybody with him. Well, you didn't tell Tecumseh he couldn't bring anybody with him. So he literally went over to the British and had at their disposal 10,000 men when our entire army was only 3,000.
Yeah, so he's at that point siding with what he thinks is going to be the winning side, or the best bet anyway, to push these Americans or keep these Americans in place at the very least.
Right.
But that only lasts about a year in his case.
Yes.
Tell us about his ultimate end and how that really is one of the key turning points in the war.
Well, basically, the British kept making the same mistake with the Indians that they did with white Americans, and that was to look down on them. And basically, they would not listen to Tecumseh. So actually, he helped one British general to take Detroit just by a ruse. He got Detroit because the American officer was scared to death of having his wife and grandchildren scalped, and surrendered Detroit, and then surrendered Chicago, and surrendered the Midwest without a fight. And that was because the people were scared to death of Tecumseh and his warriors on the frontier. But then when the fighting became one botched invasion of Canada after another, Tecumseh wanted to fight on, but the British generals wanted to back away, go into their fortifications, stay where they were strong. And he wound up dying fighting a rearguard action to protect the British army.
So he dies by the summer of 1813, but there's still plenty more conflict left. So can you tell us what are the other big theaters and big moments in the war? There's war on the high seas. There's also war on Lake Erie. What are the important ones that our listeners need to know about?
Well, much of the original fighting was on the Canadian border because the British had troops there and they had pretty well-disciplined militias, and we did very badly. We weren't well organized, etc. It was essential that we have the Great Lakes, and one of the high points of this whole struggle is shipbuilders coming, these two brothers, the Smith brothers from New York City, and their crew of shipwrights who would go anywhere and could build you a fleet. So on Lake Ontario, they build ships to take part in an invasion of what's now Toronto. And then the next year, they build Oliver Hazard Perry's fleet, which defeats a British fleet on Lake Erie.
Giving us one of the famous American military quotations, "We have met the enemy and they are ours."
Yes, exactly. But naval battles had an exaggerated importance in all of this. Naval warfare and the ships and the sea had been the cause of much of this. But in the first year of the war, we didn't win anything except one engagement between one frigate, the largest ship we had. We call it Old Ironsides, the Constitution, against one British frigate. But that encouraged Americans to think that they could defeat the British Navy. One engagement between two fairly small ships. But it happened to come during the re-election campaign of Madison in 1812, and the news of that put him over the top. Because he was re-elected, he could keep the war going. He was pro-war. But the rest of the American Navy was about 20 ships, bottled up by a huge British fleet of over 600 that were available. So most of the action became action by our private Navy, what we call the Merchant Marine. And that is businessmen, sailors, investors building 2,000 ships who had diplomatic status. If their crews were captured under the letters of marque that they were called, it was a commission from the president that said, if you're captured, you're a prisoner of war. You're not a pirate. So you couldn't even keep anybody recruited in the American Army because they all wanted to go off on these privateering ships where they too got a cut of anything they captured. So they're capturing 1,500 British ships, selling them at auction, refitting them as privateers, going out again. And the British couldn't stop them. They knew their waters so well, they were so intrepid. So the British were not winning the naval war at all.
But then things begin to shift for the British in 1814. What brings this on?
When it shifted, when things really changed, is when Napoleon capitulated at Fontainebleau in April of 1814. With Napoleon's armies defeated, the British began to send over massive reinforcements and fleets of ships. So they began raiding all along the coast. They sailed up the Connecticut River and destroyed a town that was called Essex and all the privateering ships in it. They took control of the Chesapeake. They raided from house to house pretty much, looting and burning and pillaging. The one fellow who had gotten away from the British in a sea fight, the British targeted his house. They went into his town, Havre de Grace in Maryland. They burned his father's tavern. They burned his father's house. They looted and they burned his house. By the summer of 1814, there was an entire British fleet of 50 ships full of veterans of fighting Napoleon in Spain and France that arrived off the coast of Maryland. And it was up to the commanders whether they raided Washington or not. And they decided pretty much on the spur of the moment, we're going to do it. We're going to quick march 4,400 veterans into Washington and burn it. Why? Because what we usually don't know is we burned what we now call Toronto first in 1813. So it was revenge.
Payback.
Yes. They did a surgical kind of thing. They only destroyed public buildings, but they came prepared to burn them with special weapons, papier-mâché globes full of incendiary fluid, and special tools that could hurl them through the windows of the White House.
Right. It almost sounds like an early form of napalm.
Yes, and they actually tried to blow up the Capitol building, but it was too well built. The only public building they spared was the post office, because that was also the patent office. And they were persuaded not to destroy the privately owned models inside it. But they left Washington, D.C. in flames.
That brings in the story of Dolly Madison, an important figure during that crisis. Tell us about her role.
Dolly Madison, who's really the first lady, refused to leave the White House when she could see the British Army through a telescope. She was up on the roof of the White House watching through a telescope as the Battle of Bladensburg took place. And if the telescope had been good enough, she could have seen her husband there, because James Madison, this little guy, 5'3", 100 pounds, never in the army, he was the only president to ever go out and join the troops in the battle, which was a very bad idea because his being there undermined the generals on the scene. But it was a rout. But she would not leave. Actually, she had dinner set up for the president, the cabinet, and his officers, dinner for 40, all laid out, sure that the Americans would win. Well, they didn't. So she's the last one to leave with the silverware, the state papers, and the original Declaration of Independence. Legend focuses, our mythology focuses on her cutting out a portrait of Washington and not leaving till she had that. Well, it's a copy, but she didn't know that.
Right.
So she deserves much more credit because she inspired people not to flee their homes. Most of the private houses in Washington were spared, not only because the British were given orders not to do it, but people stayed in them so they wouldn't be looted. So she's quite the heroine in this. She didn't know where he was for a few days after the fighting. He didn't know where the government was in disarray. It was gone. It was just plain gone.
Hard to imagine Washington, D.C. evacuated of its leadership so totally during such a crisis. It's pretty remarkable.
Right. From Baltimore, 30 miles away, they could see the fires. And the British did something they did it in the Revolutionary War, too. They would win a major battle, and then they would take a break. Rest, some R&R,
right.
Some good food, some good port. And it gave Samuel Smith, U.S. Senator from Maryland, who had been an officer in the Revolutionary War and knew how to defend against the British. He organized 11,000 Baltimoreans, black and white, day and night, to build something like mountains that overlooked the harbor and protected Baltimore from the back, because in the inner harbor, that's where 500 and some privateering ships had come from. And the British really wanted to take that. Not as just punishment, but the potential for loot was amazing. So the best description we have of all of that is the Star-Spangled Banner.
That's right, just a few weeks later.
Yes. Francis Scott Key, who was anti-war himself, and he was negotiating the exchange of one prisoner, an old man who had arrested British soldiers for trying to loot his house. So there's Francis Scott Key on a truce ship trying to arrange this.
Right, so he's out there on Chesapeake Bay on a British ship just before the battle begins.
Yes, and he was made to stand there because he knew what was going on and watch the assault on Fort McHenry. And he wrote it down. If you look at the second stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem, it's a perfect description of what's going on. Bombs bursting in air. Why were they bursting in air? Well, because Fort McHenry had been reinforced with French cannon that had a longer range than the British ships. The British had to back away, and they lobbed over 2,000 shells that only killed or wounded 20 people in that all-night attack. And the rockets' red glare, well, they were glaring and they were scaring people, terrifying people, but they were inaccurate, and they usually several times killed the rocketeers. So he's painting this beautiful picture of what happened. And then the commander of Fort McHenry has commissioned not the usual flag, but he's had this enormous flag made. It's at the Smithsonian. And it's the flag that was to be put up so that the people of Baltimore could see over these mounds of fortifications that the flag was still there and the fort was still there. It was really a signal for the British to leave. They had failed. Their real target, the one they were supposed to be going after, was New Orleans. Because in New Orleans, not only was there about 4 million pounds sterling of loot and privateering ships there, but control of New Orleans would have allowed the British to take the Mississippi, control the Mississippi, and cut off the United States from going farther west. And the British lost another army there.
Right. Enter Andrew Jackson. This is where he makes a name for himself and essentially becomes a national hero. Earlier, you affirmed the legend of Dolly Madison, but what about the legend of Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans?
You know, our mythology says that the real winner of the war was Andrew Jackson. He was the winner of that battle. Right. But because there's no other figure that you can identify with victory in a land battle, he becomes. Americans believe that Andrew Jackson won. That's what you're told in school. Right. Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans. He won the War of 1812.
It's almost like Americans needed, a big climax to the war. And Jackson, as you say, doesn't win the war, but he essentially spikes the football in the end zone.
Yes, exactly.
And he's also an over-the-top figure who's going to make the most of it. So maybe that is why that stands out, even though it's largely a mischaracterization.
Yeah, and the fact is that the most important battle of the war was not in New Orleans. It was not in Washington. It was not on the Canadian frontier. It was on Lake Champlain. And that's what's been overlooked. I studied the writings of Theodore Roosevelt, who was a young man right out of Harvard, got the papers from the War Department, and studied the Battle of Lake Champlain, where the Americans built a fleet overnight, these shipwrights marching up from New York again, cutting down trees in 5 days, cutting down enough tall pine trees to make 5 ships. And totally surprising, the British sailing out onto the lake just as the main British invasion was coming down from Canada. So the biggest British army in North America since the Revolution marched down the New York side of Lake Champlain, and it had to stop until there was a naval battle, because whoever won that battle decided whether the army was supported or not. Well, Thomas MacDonough, 28 years old, a lieutenant, and his ships that he had built in the woods stopped the British, destroyed them in a 2-hour battle. Very, very heavy firing, close range. And the British commander said, well, there's no point in going on because my army will not have any support, any transport, any food. So the main British invasion turned around and went back to Canada. When word of that reached Ghent in Belgium, where the negotiations over a peace treaty were taking place, both sides decided, we've had enough. Both the British and the Americans were broke after all this fighting. One of the little details that I found out, how broke can a country be? The credit of the United States was so destroyed by this war that the fellow who had to provide the copper to make the pennies refused any more credit to the government. So you don't have an 1815 penny.
Really?
I mean, that's how broke the country was.
That is the definition of broke, yes.
Yes.
So, but they're nonetheless victorious. So you're victorious and broke, and the war, as you point out, is actually quite important, even though we don't pay too much attention to it. So what does the United States win, essentially, other than the war itself? Like, what's the larger macro-level significance of this war?
Well, other than psychological, the importance of it is that the British never tried impressment again on us. We had freedom of the seas, and we had thousands of merchant ships. Take away the guns and the fighting, and you have a big merchant fleet that has learned in this war to go to South America, the South Pacific, where they will pursue the whales, the Indian Ocean, China, and we become the largest independent maritime power at that moment. We're a major player. Plus the fact that we won the admiration of a lot of countries for standing up to the British and not surrendering.
And the other factor is that, as you point out, we've become a great maritime power, but also, circling back to the story of Tecumseh, the defeat of the British really spells doom for the status of Native Americans east of the Mississippi, that they've lost their primary military backer. And that's going to mean that it's going to be much easier for the U.S. not only to be a maritime power, but a continental power, and begin to shove Native Americans westward pretty relentlessly from that point forward.
That's absolutely right. And there was no winner and no loser between the two powers. It's a stalemate. Status quo ante bellum is what the peace treaty says. Let's take everything back the way it was. Nobody won, nobody lost, except the Indian. The Indian was the big loser. They not only lost because the British would not support them or listen to them on the battlefield, but at the peace talks in Ghent, one of the first demands the British made was the old demand from the pre-revolutionary period that there be an enormous Indian reserve between the eastern colonies and the west of the continent. Well, in the dickering, they threw that out. They abandoned the Indians. No longer were they negotiating for them. So the big loser was the Native American.
Well, Willard Sterne Randall, this has been a terrific conversation, and your book is really a great telling of that story. And as we noted at the start, telling that story in a much bigger context, a 50-year context, so that you can really see how these things connect, how the War of 1812 isn't just simply this separate so-called Second War of Independence. It's actually, in some ways, the final chapter of the War of Independence. So thank you very much for talking to us at In the Past Lane.
Terrific, and it's been a lot of fun.
Willard Sterne Randall is author of Unshackling America, How the War of 1812 Truly Ended the American Revolution, published by St. Martin's Press.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. And tell your friends about In the Past Lane. That really helps to bring in new listeners. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. I also want to hear from you, so please send us your comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter, Instagram, and our Facebook page. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, how about a cheery holiday message for our listeners?
Winter is coming.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.